Greetings, World Regional Geography students. This is your instructor, Dan Scollin, and I'm going to do a little bit of a review here in advance of our final. I wanted to start off by reminding us of the title of the course as we wind down, World Regional Geography. We have been exploring world regions and world realms that are defined by unique characteristics, and also looking at the spatial aspects of how different elements of the physical landscape and the human landscape relate to one another. We've talked about relative location that helps us to understand the relationships between places. So, for example, we might talk about the relative location of Japan as a location and how its geographic situation in relation to the continent of Asia, in relation to the Pacific Rim, in relation to tectonic plate boundaries help to define and characterize that particular locale. On this opening image, we have two different pictures, one that illustrates a urban scene in the upper left-hand corner, obviously a bustling metropolis with tall buildings and lots of boats and sheltered bay. We might deduce some things about the character of this place based on the images that we see here. And in the lower right-hand corner, we see more or less natural landscape, the result of various processes of tectonic activity, climate, water resources, and the like. So this sort of gets at that division between the human and the physical sides of the study of geography. Of course, our final is going to be focused on Asia primarily, along with Australia. And we are going to start off with South Asia, which has been called the subcontinent. And here we see the great mountain of K2, which is in a mountain range found adjacent to the Himalayas. And of course, this is going to be a defining characteristic not only for the people that live in this area, but also will have a wide-ranging effect in terms of isolating South Asia from East Asia, for example. It also has the role of concentrating the effect of the monsoon, which is a defining characteristic of India's climate, and its cultures, its agricultural practices are all very closely aligned to this climatic phenomena. India is a land of contrast. We see a very ancient civilization with, in many cases, very ancient practices, whether we're talking about agriculture, transportation, in some cases, as you can see in the lower right-hand corner, antiquated and inefficient manufacturing by Western standards, and yet we also have this very emerging high technology and service sector economy that is drawing many people into the cities from the rural areas, pulling many people out of poverty, and yet at the same time we see very large numbers of people that are living in many ways the same way they may have lived 100 years or more ago. India has seen a range of conflicts. It was colonized by the English for several centuries, eventually being divided into the countries that you see illustrated on the map. Pakistan and India to this day have a very unsettled relationship as a result. Religion is a defining characteristic. Again, as a 4,000-year-old civilization, we see many religions that have emerged from India. Its defining religion of Hinduism as a polytheistic religion is going to reflect this highly diverse ethnic and cultural mosaic that is India. In this section, we talked about population and how we address population change through the demographic transition model. And this is appropriate for India because we saw this dramatic population explosion occur during the 20th century as agriculture and medicine emerged to reduce death rates, which consequently resulted in this tremendous population growth. India has now moved into stage 3, but their population is still growing. And we see countries like Japan, Germany, and even the United States moving into stage 4, which is reducing and slowing population growth rate. Pakistan is a country that is much in the interest of the United States. They have been an ally of the United States in this part of the world, but we can see on the map the tribal areas neighboring Afghanistan. These are the places where the Taliban emerged from. Indeed, Osama bin Laden was actually killed just outside of Islamabad. And so we see this element of radical Islam emerging from Pakistan, and one that is creating a lot of problems and tensions and gaining the interest of the United States. The mountain states of Nepal and Bhutan offer a contrast. Bhutan has been isolated for much of its history. Nepal has been open to the West, especially from the interest in mountaineering, but Nepal has seen much more in the way of environmental degradation and also conflicts around its civil war, and this has in some ways compromised their tourism economy. They are also a classic buffer state between the great population centers and world powers of India and China. Moving into East Asia, we could see the 5 regions of East Asia, and we see dramatic differences between these, in particular as defined by the formative Pacific Rim region of China, and then extending through to South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. This is the integrated part of East Asia that is emerging and exerting significant economic and political influence in the world today. Perhaps the most dramatic emerging part of the world over the last decade or so, especially in light of the growth of coastal China. A look at the population distribution of China illustrates just how disproportionate this population that is the world's largest at 1.3 billion people. You can see how relatively sparsely populated the western parts of China that include Tibet, which is located in this part of the map. This is Xizang, and Xinjiang, which is the home of the Muslim people known as the Uyghurs. China's ancient civilization has gone through a variety of dramatic changes, from becoming a great inventor and innovator in the world to becoming an inward-looking society that was very closed off to the outside world under a variety of emperors. We saw eventually in the mid-20th century the emergence of Mao Zedong and the Communist Party, which again was fairly closed off to the outside world, very regimented in its view of what sort of liberties and freedoms people were given. And then beginning in the 1980s, we see the economic emergence of India during that period of time. with the opening up of the economy of the coastal regions, especially the open cities and the special economic zones, we saw the economic explosion that integrated China into the world economy and elevated them to one of the world's economic and political leaders. This is illustrated by the Pacific Rim, and this has emerged as the most important trading bloc in the world today outside of Europe. There is tremendous disparity of wealth and opportunity and development. West China, as seen in the lower right, in contrast to the exploding cities of coastal China. We've seen the greatest human migration in the history of the planet occurring as people are moving from poor rural areas to the cities, and this is a source of tension in China, as is the fact that they have seen significant environmental degradation in the form of air pollution and water pollution in particular. China has a problematic relationship with many of its minority populations, as embodied with their treatment of Tibet, which is under Chinese control. And this is now becoming a challenge as China moves into different parts of the world and invests for resource extraction, for the development of other sort of manufacturing operations, and there are questions about their human rights treatment as they do so. The Korean Peninsula is certainly a place of great political concern in the world, with North Korea and their emerging nuclear program, and this is a moving target. We saw a thawing of relations and a first ever crossing of the line that separates these two, a meeting of the presidents of North Korea and South Korea in the last week, but now we again see a cooling of relations, especially as the U.S. provides military equipment into South Korea, which is our longtime ally and also Pacific Rim trading partner. Japan is a longtime ally, at least since World War II, when they were one of the primary antagonists of World War II. Japan has gone from being a colonizing power throughout the region before World War II to being defeated, to re-emerging as a industrial powerhouse, to seeing their fortunes fall back as China and others emerged, but they continue to be a thriving culture and an important economic society in spite of the fact that their population is aging perhaps more rapidly than any other in the world. Moving into Southeast Asia, we see the two principal regions. This is an example of a fragmented region and is a region that was heavily impacted by colonization from Europe, and we've seen a significant amount of conflict in the last 100 years or so, including the Vietnam War, in which the United States was engaged. The concept of state morphology, the shape of states, is nicely reflected as we see numerous examples in Southeast Asia of the predominant shapes or configurations of states. The ethnic mosaic of Southeast Asia is an interesting one. We see a fairly close alignment between certain ethnic groups and their political states, with Thai, Khmer in Cambodia, Vietnam, in Vietnam, obviously. And then we'll see a variety of different ethnic groups scattered throughout, and indigenous people and their role in the world is one theme from this section. This is a region of great historical significance, and one that is evolving in terms of being a relatively poor region with heavy dependence on natural resources for survival, and one in which we're seeing a resource grab in many cases driven by China. Japan has played a role in this as well. In some ways, Australia is starting to play a role. And this is really transforming the economies and transforming the natural landscape of these countries of Southeast Asia. Okay, Wallace's line and the study of island biogeography is an important theme in this part of the course, and we studied with some detail the biogeography of Borneo, especially in relation to some of the indigenous land rights issues going on in that part of the world. Again, we see dramatic contrast, Malaysia being a perfect example where we see a emerging and high-tech and highly developed in some respects country as they integrate with the world economy, this being West Malaysia on the mainland, and then East Malaysia where we see tropical rainforests and some of these concerns related to the conservation of these forests and also the rights of the people living there. An illustration of two residents that represent on the left the Asian biogeography and on the right the Australian biogeography. This is the home of the Great Spice Islands, which on our ancient map here you see Borneo, the Malay Peninsula, and the Spice Islands to the east that were such a motivator for the European colonizers, Dutch, the English among them. This is also a region of the highest biological diversity of the oceans and an area where we're seeing coral bleaching and overharvesting having a negative impact on the health of these vitally important reefs. Okay, and then briefly into Australia, as in spite of historically being quite isolated from the world, we start to see an increasing integration between Australia and the economies of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, and then extending up into China. This is a country that primarily trades and exports natural resources, agricultural products, and minerals in particular. And with this very arid landscape that we see in the eastern part of the country and limited water supplies, we're seeing a variety of environmental concerns, including some related to climate change, and also a variety of human-induced problems such as introduced species that have led this to be one of the most environmentally degraded places on Earth, in spite of their relatively small population. Its neighbor, New Zealand, very different geographically, spatially, in terms of its extent, in terms of the topography, in terms of its population. Again, many similarities, but some significant differences as well. Okay, well, that's the end of my presentation. We'll see you online.